Hi, and welcome to another broadcast of Learning with Power. And my name is Scott Powers Houston. This is episode 28, and this episode is going to be about the history of religion. The history of Christianity, and more specifically, the history of the Bible and how that was composed, and how it evolved over time. And so the history of Christianity, to do one episode on that, I mean, there really is a whole lot to unpack here, because there's a lot of things that contributed to it, and there's people who they go to Christian colleges and stuff, or Bible historian colleges, and they dedicate their entire lives to the study of this. So there is a lot to unpack, but I'm not going to get into the specific meanings of what the different verses mean or might mean or things like that, or who wrote them even. I'm just going to get into basically the history of Christianity and how the Bible came to be, and then how it evolved a little bit after that point. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about here is basically that the thing about history is really anything older than even in some cases pre-1500s is not known about. In certain parts of the world, all we have is just archaeological remains and things. And so even though history starts when writing starts, we didn't have movie cameras then, we didn't have the internet then, and so you don't know for 100%, exactly what happened, sometimes. And we didn't have newspapers, the time that Jesus supposedly walked and was reborn and everything. We didn't have newspapers at the time. It wasn't the headline of, Jerusalem, 4 A.D., Jesus rises from the dead. It wasn't in a newspaper. And despite common belief and common perceptions, is that there are no Roman records of the trial of Jesus. And I know that a lot of people say that there are, but there are not. There were none. Nothing exists of that, and there's not even any mention of that in any Roman documents, actual Roman documents. It's only in the Bible, no other place. And to me, if something is only talked about in the Bible, to me that has a dubious historical reference, because it's just a narrative. It's like saying Rumpelstiltskin is real, because there's a book about Rumpelstiltskin, and according to the book, he was real. It must be a real person. It must have been about a real person, but obviously not. And it's not been claimed that he was, but you get the idea. I mean, it's a book that was written a long time ago. We don't know, right? So what do we know? How do we chronicle history? How do we suss out, as historians, archaeologists, whatever, how do we suss out what actually did happen? And so the first thing is you have historical records. So starting in around 3500 BC, we actually have some documentation of some things that have happened. And then starting around 300-400 BC, you have actual what are called chroniclers, the first of whom was a guy named Herodotus. He tried to chronicle history up to that point. But aside from the chroniclers, and so the chroniclers are fairly far and few between, and then the Roman emperors had a court-appointed chronicler sometimes, and so we had a little bit more history than in Rome, starting at around 100 BC, and then, but it wasn't until actually newspapers didn't come around until the 1700s. All right. The other thing is that we have is archaeology. And so archaeological records are sort of indisputable. So even something as recent as Custer in the late 1800s, there's a historical record and a historical documentation of what happened in the last stand of Custer. Hi, and we are back. Unfortunately, the other episode had to be interrupted due to unforeseen circumstances a couple days ago. But trying to continue from there, and I'm wearing the same outfit mainly because I'm trying to continue the continuity. Alright, so let's go. So I was talking about basically the four things that is how we know for sure that something really happened in history. And so one thing that we have is archaeological records. And the one thing that archaeological records can do, and I was talking about it before with Custer, is that it can, you know, despite what the narrative might be or what the popular narrative might be, archaeological records don't lie. It just is what it is. And so we've more recently gone back to like the area where Custer's last stand happened, and we realized that it's not actually the heroic battle that was depicted or was told in, you know, in the newspapers or whatever the narrative at the time. It's not really, didn't really happen that way. So that's how archaeology plays a role. And actually archaeology really is the only thing that you can know for certain. And then of course there are historical chroniclers. Now I mentioned Herodotus. Herodotus was really more or less the first real historical chronicler, and he really tried to put together like a historical account. And he lived in around the 400s BC, around the mid-400s BC, mid-5th century BC. And so, you know, he did his best, but, you know, a lot of tales that he's talking about happened in like 500, 600, 700, 800 BC. So, you know, how accurate can he really be? He's basically just going from narratives and things like that for the most part. And then we have to back it up with archaeological evidence. The other thing that you can do when you're talking about like what really happened is you can say, well, how did we get here? So like the Bible exists. It's been around for centuries. It happened somehow. Somebody made it. Somebody came up with all these ideas. There's a lot of clever stuff. A lot of clever stories and things that are in the Bible. Where did it come from? Had to come from somewhere. So there's that. You know, how did we get here? I mean, the Roman Empire must have had some trouble at some point because we're not all part of the Roman Empire anymore. Things like that. So how do we get here? That's another thing that can help us try to suss out what's real and what's maybe just narrative. And I talked about before what a narrative is. So like a narrative can be like Marco Polo or King Arthur, which were stories that were printed in the Middle Ages that basically became accepted as like facts, when actually recently we're going back in and we're finding evidence that, well, maybe King Arthur wasn't a real person, maybe he was an amalgamation of several different characters just to create a character for you know, basically a story. And Marco Polo was really basically the same thing, even though in Asia they still say, oh no, he was real, which is interesting because he came from the West. So, and I guess it's the way that they legitimize their presence or something amongst the West, or their level of evolution or industrialization compared to the West. You know, they try to compare themselves, but you know, it's basically probably most likely a fabricated tale. And then that's where we get to the fourth thing, which is historical fiction. So the story of like King Arthur does have some real, you know, origins of things that happened. There is some basis behind it. And there's been a lot of things like that, a lot of tales which are historical fiction. It becomes narrative, something that's part of the basically vernacular that everybody accepts, which started as historical fiction, but it does have some roots of like of facts, some reality is there, and a lot of the Bible is historical fiction. Sorry to say. So, where did the whole idea of the Bible come from? Where did the concepts come from? Where do they originate from? Well, you can go way back. I mean, according to the Old Testament, which basically is the foundation for, or is derived from the Torah, which was prayed to by the Jews, they claim that the beginning was Abraham, who, as near as we can figure, lived around 1800 BC. And Abraham is actually the father of all of what's called the desert religions. It's hard to ascertain for certain. You know, there's no actual records or anything other than just what they talk about, and they discuss his descendants and things like that. And basically, through computations, they work out that maybe he might have existed in 1800 BC. And all three of the desert religions, which is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all except Muslim is like the founder of the faith. Basically, but then you've got some other things that happen too. You've also got this guy called Isaiah, who was in the 7th century, 8th to 7th century BC, who was, he came up with the idea of that there might be a Messiah. And Judaism really kind of evolved around this time. And Judaism was kind of radical in that it was monotheistic. There were other monotheistic religions in the world at the time, such as Jainism, which was basically inspired by a guy named Mahavira, Mahavira. And then, like I said in the lecture before about the history of religion, you have in Egypt in like 1300 BC, there was the first monotheism. So there was origins of that. And so the narrative of like, and so then you have Zoroaster, and he was around like in the 500s BC, the 6th century. He was another one of these amazing, great religious philosophers that existed at the time, along with Buddha and people like that. He had similar ideas to what Christianity has now. He talks about having free will, that there's one God. So Zoroastrianism is monotheistic. He also talks about the end times, which is a new concept. And so we have the concept of the Messiah, we have the concept of the end times, we have the concept of one God, we have the concept of free will. These things all started to evolve around 500-600 BC. Maybe around 520 BC. And then we have Jews, we have evidence of Jews migrating to India in the 6th century BC, bringing with them their idea of monotheism and things like that. And that kind of combined with the teachings of Mahavira and kind of created Jainism, which is sort of a similar in a lot of ways to Christianity today. We also have in the same time another great philosopher called Laozi in China. And he basically created Taoism in the 5th or 6th century BC. And that also has a lot of theoretical and philosophical origins that you can trace to the Bible. Also in the Bible, you know, the whole idea of Christmas and things like that comes from Saturnalia. That was a Roman holiday from, years before. There's lots of origins of all of the narrative, the basic narratives of Christianity, all originated earlier. The idea of a heaven was also already a thing. And also the idea that God is a human. So the very first evidence of God being in a human-like form, so before that, gods were always like, birds or, some amalgamation of like man and beast or something, gods. But the idea of God being human-like actually comes from Hindu, the idea of the avatar, which is called the post-Vedic period, which is around 1400 BC is when the gods, in India anyway, became human-like. They became a human sort of concept. So that concept also existed. And then also a lot of people argue that basically the concept really of monotheism really took hold around, coincidentally, the same time, around 600 BC, which was more or less the advent of money. And so you have people saying, there's one God, and I am the way to that God. Please give me money. And so all that is the origins of Christianity, and where did it really originate from? All right, and so now we get to the next concept. I'm getting there. All right, when did the next things happen? So then we get to basically the beginning of actual Christianity, and how did it evolve? Well, Christianity basically evolved from Judaism, which basically is not argued. And so what was happening with Judaism around, let's say, the 1st century BC? Well, Judaism, because it was monotheistic, was diametrically opposed to what the Romans believed and what the Greeks had believed before them. But the Roman Empire really kind of became strong. And in fact, they were at its height in around 100 BC to around 100 AD is when Rome really had its height. And so the Jews were being persecuted a lot by the Romans. They were being, messed around by the Romans a lot. And so when they talk about the coming of a Savior or the coming of Messiah, Savior from what? Well, the Roman Empire really is what they wanted to be saved from, because and ultimately this culminated in what's called the Jewish Revolt, which was in AD, was 66 to 73 AD, and culminated at the end with the Siege of Masada. And that was really when the Romans put down Judaism, and that was thought by the Romans to be the end of Judaism, but it wasn't actually. And it was around this time, coincidentally, probably not coincidentally, that Christianity, the concept of Christianity, starts to emerge in the vernacular, of the narrative of religion at the time. And where does it come from? Well, it comes from, the nearest we can tell, it originated with a guy called Paul, around maybe 60-ish AD. Around the time when the Jewish revolt was getting to be really, really intense. The war basically between Judaism and the Roman authorities. And so all these attempts before at a Messiah, the Romans found out about him and they would just execute him, And so if you're the Messiah, then how did you get executed? Why does that happen? So basically you have this guy that says, well, no, Jesus is like this spiritual thing. And he did exist, and he was executed. But I think that's probably from the New Testament, because if you really look at Paul, he doesn't really talk about Jesus being a real person. He talks about him being a spiritual being. But the spiritual Messiah. So it's saying like, well, you don't need a real person to pray to. You can pray to this spiritual Messiah. The Romans can't kill him. The Romans can't do anything about how you think. And you can just pray to him privately and just know that he is going to save you. He's going to save your soul. If you just believe in him, he'll save your soul, and all the things that comes from Paul. All right. And so proponents of the history of Christian, like these Bible historians, will say, oh, well, the first Christian council of the apostles happened in around 60 AD. Well, that's depicted in Acts. Again, it's the New Testament, and there's no evidence for it anywhere else. There's absolutely zero actual evidence that such a council ever happened. Likewise, there is no evidence of the existence of the first 3 supposed popes of the Bible. They're only mentioned in the Bible. There's no actual Roman records, no Roman history of any of these people ever even existing. For that matter, we're not even sure about John the Baptist. Now, he may have existed, and the main reason why is because he's not just in biblical narratives, but he's also in some other narratives that they kind of mention him, but not any kind of historical documentation. But so he may or may not have existed. And if Jesus didn't exist, then he wouldn't have baptized them, but supposedly he was baptizing people or whatever. We're not totally sure. It's not confirmed. And basically, so when did really Christianity come from? And so where was Paul? Paul came from Tarsus, which I talked about before, which is in modern-day Turkey. And that's where the narrative really begins there. And so the oldest book of the Bible, the oldest book of the New Testament, the oldest book I should say of the New Testament, is Matthew. But the earliest fragments that we have of any Matthew texts is from around 225 AD, so 200 and something years after Jesus. Then John, actually the oldest actual fragments that we can find of any actual scripture that actually existed were fragments of John, which were written around somewhere between 100 and 120 AD. And we think that it was maybe written around 90 AD. And it's in fact around 90 AD that the first real evidence of any type of a leader, like a Christian leader, who is Clement I, is really the first pope that we can attribute, that we can say, yeah, there's documentation, some documentation to suggest he's real. So Christianity really seems to, so maybe it was created by Paul, around 60 AD as an answer to the Jewish revolt, and then it kind of gradually grew. And then around 90, they started to write it down, and it started to become more of a thing. When it became a really big thing was around 98 AD with Emperor Trajan. So when he comes in, and certainly around 100 AD, because really in the first decade of the 2nd century AD is really when Christianity, or the concept or the idea of Christianity, really took off. And it went viral. It became a fad or something. It went all over the place. And there were some basic tenets to this new religion as to why it spread so fast. So a lot of modern day Bible historians like to say, well, it spread so fast, it must be because it was true. That's evidence that it's true, because when something is true and it rings true to people, then they accept that. Well, the other reasons why it spread around is because basically the concepts of heaven and hell. And so with Judaism, the practice was that you had to go to the Temple Mount, and you had to pray up there, and you had to sacrifice a lamb or something like that. And the richer you were, the cooler, bigger lamb that you could get, that you could sacrifice and bled more blood or something. And so really the best blessings were only for the richest. The richest people got the biggest blessings, and if you're not poor, and if you're poor and you couldn't afford to waste money on a sheep just to kill them for a sacrifice, you're out. You're not sacrificing. You're not blessed by God. What are you going to do? And so with this new religion, the new religion said, all you have to do is believe in Jesus. And Paul never met Jesus. He was not an apostle, which a lot of people misunderstand. None of those things. He never met him. He wasn't an apostle. So he doesn't have any personal testimony of Jesus' existence. But the idea that spread around was that if you just believe that this Jesus, this spiritual Jesus, whether he's spiritual or not, if you just believe in that and believe that he will save your soul, then your soul will be saved. And then you would be basically a Christian. And in fact, if you're rich, that it's not going to be good, because rich people can get saved by sacrificing the biggest lamb. Only the poorest people really can go to heaven. There's a line in there about the chances of a rich person going to heaven is like a camel going through the eye of a needle or something like that. So it was for the poor people. It was for the 98%. And so this was a religion that 98% can get to heaven. And if you're rich, in fact, it's bad, because they don't really believe truly in their heart. They're still Jews and they're still making a sacrifice. But if you really, really pray hard, you'll go to heaven. And being poor, you have a better advantage, because what else are you going to do? What other hope do you have, right? And so that's why Jesus is the Savior. And so the other thing that really sold it was, it's long been known that the way that you sell something is fear of loss. Fear of loss is a much greater motivator than promise of gain. And so Judaism, or not Judaism, but Christianity actually instituted the concept of damnation in hell. So that if you don't believe in Jesus, you will be damned to hell. So all the Jews, and of course all the Romans and the Greeks, but all the Jews will be damned to hell. And if you don't believe in Jesus, you will be damned to hell. And even to this day, that is a huge motivator why a lot of people on their deathbed will accept Jesus, because they don't know. Nobody can know for certain whether, how true that is. You know what I mean? But that narrative evolved with Christianity. And like I said, it really emerged in around the first decade of the 2nd century AD. And there's no actual hard evidence that it existed before then. To say that it existed starting with Paul around 60 AD there's not concrete evidence. It's just surmised, and that of course if it took off at around 100 AD or 98 AD, it obviously had to exist in some form or some written form before that time. So we think around 90 AD is the beginning of when it really started. Okay, and so where did Christianity go from there? And so it became a big fad. It was a big thing, and of course all the Romans were going crazy trying to put it down. And now, instead of just the Jews, now they've got even a bigger problem with Christians. And so they're executing Christians all over the place. And if you're caught believing in Christianity, it was a death sentence. Or practicing Christianity, because the Romans were trying to, rule with an iron fist, basically. And so Christianity sort of began as a cult. And there were lots of different sects of this cult. All these different cults, they would meet in private. Maybe 25 people would meet in a shelter, underground shelter or something, trying to hide away from the Romans. And they all had their own little beliefs about it. And so there was maybe like 100 different cults. And probably the most famous cult was the Coptics. And they primarily were in Egypt. So the Coptics, ultimately their version of Christianity did not hold true, but one of the things that we owe to the Coptics is this concept of the Emerald Tablet. I don't know if you are familiar with that. It's even in modern times, it's like a source of mysticism. It's like a mystic belief. And Coptics today in Egypt still preach Christianity, and basically, really, Egypt is the Egyptian Christianity, which originated from the Coptics, is really the earliest form of Christianity that still exists, and they still pray to it, they still preach it. All right. So then, what's the next thing that happened and then the other thing that the Coptics brought us was the concept of monasticism. And so even today there's monasteries in Egypt that date back to possibly the 200s AD. Evidence of some early monasteries that they're finding. So that predates, Constantine, of course. And then that's actually the next thing that happened, really, is Constantine. All right, and so everybody knows Constantine the Great. And he's basically called Constantine the Great because basically he legalized Christianity. So for the last 200 years, the Romans had been chasing down Christians and executing them for not believing in the state religion. So different emperors were more furious about this or more ambitious about this than others. And so there were some emperors that were just like, I don't really care. And some emperors really tried to crack down on it, kind of like Bloody Mary, the Queen Mary really tried to crack down on the Protestants. The Christians were executed or not, depending upon the emperor's feelings or tastes about it. But finally Constantine became the emperor of Rome. And not only did he move the capital from Rome to Constantinople, but he also decided that in 313 AD that he would legalize Christianity. Not that he accepted it or became a Christian or anything like that, just that he made it legal, which meant that you could now pray to God in the open. You could build a church even, an actual church that people go to without any fear of being executed or persecuted or whatever by the government. It was legal now. Came out in the open. They're making cocaine legal finally. No, I mean they're making Christianity legal finally, and now everybody is out in the open doing it. Don't have to hide with it anymore. And so all the sources, for this come out of the woodwork. And so Christianity now really began to evolve because there's nothing holding it back anymore. And people were like, well, what is Christianity? Because up to that point, there had been all these different cults, of sects of Christianity, like 100 of them. And so, like, what really is Jesus? What was Jesus really? What's the true nature of Jesus? What was Jesus really? All this sort of thing. And all this was primarily discussed in Turkey, in the Byzantine Empire, which was centered in Turkey. And all these discussions happened in Turkey. And so for Christians that want to believe that Christianity comes from Judaism, or it comes even from Rome, it comes from Turkey. That's the Holy Land. That's the Promised Land. The land that the Fourth Crusades came in and destroyed Constantinople and destroyed the whole area. They were actually destroying the Holy Land that they were going to fight to protect. They actually destroyed the Holy Land. Anyway, that's another quirk of history, and that's what ignorance. That happens with ignorance. That's what results from ignorance. Okay, so the next thing that happened is we have the Council of Nicaea. So now, at the Council of Nicaea, there was a big, and that was in 325. So between 313 and 325, there was all this debate about what is Christianity. So finally they have this big council of all of the big wigs in Christianity. They all got together in Nicaea, again in Turkey, and they all come together, and they are like, well, this we're going to accept, this we're not. And so as many scriptures as they could get, and as many texts or many narratives as they could get together about all from all the different cults of Christianity. They tried to come up with, what's officially Christianity. And one of the main things that they created at that time, the narrative that they actually created at that time, was the idea of the Trinity. That Jesus was all things. He was real. He was a spirit. He was the Son of God, the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. So that concept of the Trinity started at that time. That's when it began. And so then they went about set about actually writing the first sort of Bible. So let's write a Bible. Let's write all this down. Let's say, okay, and in those days you couldn't just do it, immediately. It took a while. And so it wasn't really until around 350 AD, like 25 years later, that they actually came out with what's called the Codex of Sinaiticus, like from Sinai, which is actually Egypt, right? Codex Sinaiticus, and and it was written in Greek because that was more or less the official language of the Byzantine Empire, which was the Roman Empire. It just now is the Roman Empire based in Turkey, or centered in Turkey now, rather than actually Rome. And so, and it's a codex, so it's not a scroll. It's not a scripture, it's an actual book that's got some type of binding with the pages being a certain size, each page being a certain size, and it's called a codex. And really it was the Codex Sinaiticus, is really one of the first books that was, or first codexes ever written in history. And it was written, for that purpose, was to say, okay, what is Christianity? But still, people were debating, because people that believed in these cults and believed in these sects and believed in this type of Christianity for the last, 200 years up to that point, weren't necessarily the ones that opposed whatever was written in this codex. weren't necessarily willing to give up their beliefs just like that. Like, oh, okay, well, we'll just change our ideas. You know, people don't like to do that. And so in 380 AD, Theodosius I, who was the last emperor of all of Rome unified. After him, Rome had two emperors, an Eastern emperor and a Western emperor, but he was the last emperor of everything. And he came up with the idea of what's called Nicene Christianity, which is what they still practice today, and it is the foundation for what is today Catholicism. And then he also made it a state religion. So Constantine may have said that it's legal now to practice Christianity, but he didn't actually, he didn't go so far as to say that Christianity is the state religion. That wasn't done until Theodosius I in 380 AD. So that's another thing to remember. But because Theodosius says, and he's the emperor, and he's not only legal, but this is what's legal, and this is the codex, and you know, Nicene Christianity. Then Christianity, or what is Christianity, or what the narrative of Christianity from that point onward became much more well defined. And so then you have the Holy Trinity, and you have all of the narrative of of Matthew and John, and of the resurrection and all this kind of stuff. Now this is all like established at this time. Now, of course, like I said, this is written in Greek. And if you don't speak Greek, or if you can't read Greek, then you couldn't read the Bible. And this was an issue for a very long time. Even after they translated the Bible into Latin, still you couldn't read it, you know, until it was finally translated into a more public, more available language that people knew. And in fact, so like I said, I was talking about the popes before. So who was the first pope? Well, the first pope was basically Saint Clement, or Clement I, around 90 AD. And then from that point onward, the popes became more and more, let's say, powerful. But until Theodosius, they didn't really have that much power. They became really powerful starting around 380 AD. And it's actually one of the reasons why people think that the empire started to fall apart at that time, because now people are like, well, who's really the boss? Is it the Pope, or is it Theodosius? Which one? And so Theodosius was around, I think, until 395. But after him, the empire had two emperors, and the debate over who's really more powerful, one of the emperors or the Pope, became a real issue. And ultimately, you know, things kind of started to fall apart at that point. Okay, so where does that bring us to? So now we were on talking about Theodosius. All right, and so the next thing that happened within the history of the Bible is we have what's called the First Council of Ephesus. Again, where's Ephesus? It's in Turkey. Okay, and so in 449 AD, Eutyches, or something like that, Eutyches, and they talked about the nature of Christ. And what is the nature of Christ? What is the true nature of Christ? Because there is still some debate. And ultimately, today, there is debate over it. And it ultimately spun off into, this argument ultimately spun off into the three basic sects of Christianity that exist today, which is basically Eastern Orthodox, Catholicism, Protestantism. Those are the three basic sects of Christianity even today, and one of the central themes of differences is the nature of Christ. What is the real nature of Christ? Okay, and so Christianity didn't really have a true identity until that time. Okay, so the next thing, I have it. Okay, so then two things happened then in the 600s, okay, both in the East and in the West. So what happened in the East was you have Muhammad in around 600 AD. He comes up with this, and before this time, the Muslims in this area, okay, the people in this area were Zoroastrians. And so the idea of a monotheistic religion, even though Zoroastrianism is really closely linked to Hinduism or Jainism, who comes from Mahavira, They also believed, though, in monotheism, and then the idea of the end times, free will, even the idea of a Messiah or a prophet that will lead us to salvation. And what they decided, what Muhammad decided, was that he was going to be the prophet. And I'm not belittling Islam. I'm not saying that he wasn't the prophet or anything like that. I'm just saying that he had a dream that Gabriel came and visited him or something, and he woke up one day and decided, you know, this is what I have to do. And he was inspired with this whole narrative that came out around that time, and it became a major religion. And more or less, their concept is that it's like the most updated, modern, most official by God creation of the desert religions. You know, this is the, you know, you have Judaism, it was updated with Christianity, it's been updated even more with Islam. And so, and actually in Islam, they give Jesus a lot of respect. They actually say he was a prophet, which is all that Muhammad says that he is. He doesn't say he was the son of God. He doesn't say that he's the savior. He just says that he's a prophet. And so they say that Jesus equally was a prophet. But they say that Muhammad is like the prophet that God says, this is the guy you should follow. This other prophet, yeah, he was good, but this is really the guy that you should follow. And that was the big thing that happened with Islam. So that doesn't really have to do with Christianity. So what was happening with Christianity was actually in England, there was a monk called Bede, B-E-D-E. And he was not only the first guy to really use dates, and so the idea or the concept of using dates, as far as the type of dates that we use, like starting from Jesus's time, really the concept for that began around 700 AD. Before that time, we didn't use those kinds of dates within history, and people that recorded history or whatever did not say that, you know, so nobody wrote in 600 AD and said this is 600 AD. That didn't happen. It didn't exist at that time. It was proposed first by Bede, who was not only a monk, but he became a very popular historian, and he promoted the idea of like social welfare. And he also, you know, so like Muhammad was like promoting a war against any kind of infidel. Anybody that didn't accept Muhammad was murdered, basically. Well, at the same time, Bede basically authorized the same thing, that we have to have a war against non-believers, and that was sort of the foundation or the origin of what ultimately became the Crusades, like 400 years or 350 years later. Or like, well, really 300, no, 350. It was like late 1000s, the Crusades, 1095. And so, and he also had this idea of like not just the end times, but like a destiny. So like the manifest destiny of like Christianity is going to take over the world, and it's the ultimate destiny of Jesus and the word of Jesus or whatever is that it's going to become this worldwide phenomenon, which it still hasn't done. And that's its destiny. And it's that idea of destiny really is what propelled the Puritans and the early settlers of America to go westward with this idea of destiny. And that really comes from Bede, from around 700 AD. Very important historian, because he actually wrote stuff down. So that made it more, you know, in stone. You didn't have to write it in stone in those days, but more or less you get the idea. Okay. Also, by 600 AD, the whole idea of polytheism and polytheistic religions really became passé at that point. And any of the polytheistic religions kind of sort of waned at that point. Kind of became, well, you know, monotheism really took over around the world as like the, you know, where it's at. That is where it's at. Okay, and so then it brings us to the 800s. Now in the 800s we have a thing in the in Byzantine Empire, which was Rome, And it was the strongest, most dominant empire in the world at that time, and the most influential empire in the world at that time. And they had this huge debate over what was called iconoclasm. So they had this, and it created wars, between the emperors, kind of like Protestantism and Catholicism in later times. So the whole idea of the iconoclasm and the iconoclast debates, not a war, but just kind of civil wars maybe. And so around that time, to justify Christianity, a lot of the idea of relics. And so you have all these cathedrals now that are being built with, and they all are centered around this relic. Like they have a hair from Paul, or they have the true cross of Jesus. That was the most important relic, the piece of that cross. Or the Holy Grail, or whatever, or different, the bones of Saint Peter, or something like that. Those were all relics. And pretty much every one of them has proven to be a fraud. And most importantly, the Shroud of Turin is definitely a fraud. And I know that a lot of people don't like to believe that, but they have concretely proven that it can't possibly be what they claim that it is. And in fact, it was created around 1260 AD. But during this time of relics, of when relics became a really big thing. And it was created using red ochre and then like a gel over that. They even know how it was made. And so all these things were made to, again, give authority, to give a legitimacy to the different cathedrals. And that's the next era that happens that I want to talk about, which is the era of cathedrals. And so that started in around the 10th century AD, was when cathedrals, let me get to that, became a thing. Okay, yeah, the 10th century AD, cathedrals. And actually, in the 1000s and 1100s and 1200s, they were getting to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, with the flying buttresses and all this kind of stuff. The world started to develop now. The West is getting more economically sound now, and they put all their money into cathedrals. And really at this time, whatever your religion was, so Christianity in the West and Islam in the East, and in the Far East, Buddhism or Hinduism, if you didn't believe, you were executed. And this goes, the worst case of this was, of course, in the 1600s, the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Basically in Spain, if you didn't believe if you weren't Catholic and you didn't believe in Jesus, off with your head. And even the time of like Joan of Arc, in the 1400s, if you didn't really say the prescribed things, if you didn't talk, promote the narrative or the accepted narrative of the day, you're a heretic, off with your head. And so, and around the 1200s is when the world starts to become more educated. You've got education happening in the Middle East, but that also spread, like mathematics and things, spread to the West. And you have the first universities, so like Oxford and Cambridge, that begin. And the early, I can't think of the word I'm thinking of, but anyway, the early teachings mandated that you had to study Latin. And that became required a course all the way until the middle of the 1900s, that you had to study Latin. And why did you have to study Latin? Because Latin was the official language of the Bible. Because at that time, there were no Bibles in English or German or anything else. There was no other kind of Bible. You had to know Latin in order to know the Bible. Which brings us to the next main thing that happened, which was Henry VIII. So Henry VIII, for his own personal purposes, rejected Christianity, or rejected Catholicism, and decided to make his own state religion. Now, what predated Henry VIII was this guy called Martin Luther, who put up his 20 things on. He posted it on a church in Weems, I guess it was, and in Germany, and it became, and by this time we've got printing press now. And so they were making pamphlets and everything, and so it spread a lot faster. And so I was talking before about how history, when you have a modern invention of like communication, like now with the internet and social media, at the time it was the printing press, things can travel a lot faster, things can go viral a lot faster. And it did, much more than what Martin Luther ever anticipated possibly happening. And so, so what happened was, after that, was the very first translation of the Bible in any language other than Latin was actually done in German by a guy called, and it's early 1500s, and actually Martin Luther did it. He did the first translation. That was what he, so after he posted the things that he had the problem with the Catholic Church, which mainly was basically that you could buy blessings. That was like the last straw for him. So so that began the Protestant Revolution, and it was a big deal, and it was the second major shift in Christianity. The first one being the Great Schism of 1054, and so that's when the Catholics of the West divorced themselves from the ideology of the East, mainly over, again, the same idea of the nature of Jesus. And that was in 1054. They had this great schism, and they were united before then, but at that point they decided, you know what, we cannot agree. We're going to have to agree to disagree. And yes, you're Christians, that's great, but we don't believe in your type of Christianity. So that was the first divide. Okay, so you have Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox. But the next great divide happened in the early 1500s with Protestantism and versus Protestantism, the base word being protests, and Catholicism. And Protestantism began, like I said, German translations, and soon thereafter there was a guy called William Tyndale that was authorized by Henry VIII, and then ultimately a guy called Miles Coverdale that created the very first Bible in the 1500s in English. And it was Henry VIII's version of Christianity, which was Protestantism now, the Church of England. And so then after that you have the most recent version of the Bible that a lot of people still use, which was called the King James Bible. And the Puritans, when they were cast out of England because they were so strict and intolerable to anything else, they went to the New World to pray because there was nowhere else for them to go. And they took with them this King James version of the Bible, King James being in the early 1600s. And they said, this is the Bible, period, the end. And it became the foundation for what is, the Bible, even, to this day. And so the Bible then still evolved. You've got Mormons, you've got other sects, and basically eventually you have these things that came out. And so in the 1700s, academia actually becomes much more of a big thing, but academia was centered around, like it was in the 1200s, was centered around really religious study and Bible Bible and religious teachings. And as the more that they learned about the world and the more information that they got, and they prayed and they decided, yeah, this is really real, they started putting it into a Bible. And it became a Bible encyclopedia. So this is from the middle of the 1800s. And so this is why people used to say, everything you need to know is right here in this here book. This is the Word of God, and if he wanted you to know anything else, he'd make it available to you. But everything you need to know is right here. Right here, this is the Word of God. And that's what people believed. And eventually, as academics expanded, the Bible expanded also, and it became, encyclopedias. And, and then now, of course, it's been abandoned, and it's Wikipedia. All right, and so that brings us up to the modern day incarnation of Christianity and the Bible, of what is the Bible. And so, is there anything that I forgot to mention? Because I get really annoyed with myself if I forgot to mention something. Okay, talked about all that. Also the story of Moses and Ramses. Moses, which was supposed to happen around the time of Ramses II. There is some indication in early hieroglyphics from around that time that maybe there was some sort of a visitor, you know, from the east, for them at the time, east of Egypt. So maybe, you know, he may have existed. It's a possibility. That was something I wanted to mention. Spanish Inquisition. I talked about how, in the last episode, how India is actually the most spiritual place on earth, and so it's really the origins of all religions, really comes from Egypt, from India. India really is the origin of all religions. I talked about how it was a desert religion. I talked about Isaiah, and talked about all these things. Talked about John and Matthew. Okay, basically that brings us up to date. All right, so like I said, middle of the 1800s, this is an encyclopedia. It's actually called a Bible encyclopedia. All right, and then that expanded to regular encyclopedias and then different versions of the Bible, but still the King James Version is what most people say this is the Bible. And that it's left over from Puritanism, from the early founders, not just of America. We're talking about the early 1600s, the Puritans that first arrived at Plymouth Rock and Jamestown and those places. Okay, so that about covers the history of Christianity and the history of the Bible. Again, my name is Scott Powers Houston, and tune in next time, and we will talk about the historicity of Jesus. Jesus, we'll discuss whether or not Jesus was a real person or not. We'll discuss that in the next episode. Be sure to catch it. Don't miss it. Be sure to like, subscribe, share all these episodes. I'd really appreciate it. We also do some stuff on TikTok. We take like excerpts from the YouTube channels and we put it on TikTok. They've been doing really well. So we hope to see you there. Take care until then. Bye.